Another key component to the First Amendment is the part about freedom of speech. And what makes freedom of speech pretty tricky is that beliefs are most protected. Actions can be most restricted, but speech is going to fall somewhere in the middle. But it's important to remember that when we're talking about freedom of speech, this extends to both the freedom of giving and hearing speech. Freedom of speech really is best explained by looking at different court tests and court rulings. One of the first tests was the bad tendency doctrine, and this is that freedom of speech can be limited when it might lead to harm, and this should be determined at the state level. At the federal level, it was the Supreme Court case of Shank versus United States in 1919 that established the clear and present danger test. This is that speech can be suppressed only if there is an imminent threat to society. And we are even more likely to do this and exercise this during a time of war. So during a wartime, individual civil liberties are more likely to be restricted, particularly speech, if it is deemed to be something that could incite aggression, combativeness, that could create danger. It's also the clear and present danger test that makes it so that it is actually illegal and punishable if someone stands up in a movie theater or in any kind of crowd and yells fire when there's actually not a fire. If it is deemed that what the person said was putting people around him in a seriously dangerous situation, then that is punishable. The preferred position doctrine said that free speech is of the utmost importance, therefore it should be restricted only when necessary. Other concepts that have since come out of this, prior restraint. So the American press is protected from prior restraint. So what this means is that the government cannot block speech before it is given. That is unconstitutional. And an example would be the Pentagon Papers case. The Pentagon Papers case refers to a study prepared by the Department of Defense in which a bunch of information was discovered and released by Daniel Ellsberg, who printed top secret documents on the front page of the New York Times. And what was in these documents was that it revealed the U.S. had secretly enlarged the scale of the Vietnam War with the bombings of nearby Cambodia and Laos, none of which had ever been reported in the mainstream media. Because of his disclosure of the Pentagon Papers, Ellsberg was initially charged with conspiracy, espionage, and theft of government property. But the charges were later dropped after prosecutors investigating the Watergate scandal soon discovered that the Nixon administration had ordered the so-called White House plumbers to engage in unlawful efforts to discredit Ellsberg. In June 2011, the entire set of the Pentagon Papers was declassified and publicly released. So essentially, the government cannot censor the press, cannot withhold information that is of public knowledge or the public has the right to hear. The restrictions put on speech must be made very clear, and this is one of the toughest challenges that the government faces, is the amount of vagueness that they need to limit when deciding how they're going to restrict speech. Least drastic means is that laws or statutes cannot restrict speech if there are other possible means to handle the situation. Freedom of speech, again, is one of the liberties that is tried to be least restricted, and so states have been told to try to find other alternative solutions before they have to restrict speech. Not to say that speech does not come with controversy. Symbolic speech has been deemed a form of expression that is protected under the First Amendment. This is somewhere between speech and action, and it generally, again, is protected. Symbolic speech is what makes it legal to burn the American flag. The Supreme Court case in 1984, Texas versus Johnson, established this principle that even though it might be unpopular, even though it might be unpatriotic, it is protected under the symbolic speech part of freedom of speech. However, draft card burning is not okay. So there can be limits on unpopular symbolic speech, but most often it is going to be protected. Another more contemporary example I wanted to share is out of Kansas. There is a I'm using sarcastic air quotes, church called the Westboro Baptist Church. And this is a group, it's essentially a family, they're all related somehow, of people whose main act is to attend the funerals of American soldiers who have been killed overseas, and they protest on the grounds that they believe that the soldiers deserve to die. God wanted to punish them because these soldiers were defending a country that allows homosexuality. This group is hugely unpopular, and essentially, again, they try to be demonstrative and attention-seeking by attending funerals of deceased soldiers. Now, they are kind of evil geniuses because a lot of members of this Westboro Baptist Church actually have law degrees and understand how to toe the limit so that what they are doing, although just absolutely cruel, inhumane, and awful, is not illegal. And so different state and local governments have now limited their right to assemble and freedom of speech so that they need to maintain a certain distance away from places of memorial, but they will still show up and then really literally and figuratively toe that line so that they cannot get arrested. It's really awful. It's it's terrible. It's mean. I don't know what to say. It's dark-hearted, but it is protected by the First Amendment freedom of speech. Sedition, which is defined as to conduct or have a speech inciting people to rebel against the authority of a state, is prohibited when imminent danger of overthrow is existing. And again, the most difficult part of this regulation is going to be defining what exactly does imminent danger look like, and that's what the courts need to decide when they're given cases regarding this. Claimed by the President of the United States and other members of the executive branch to resist certain subpoenas and other interventions by legislative and judicial branches of government to access information and personnel relating to the executive branch. Gag orders can also be issued by a judge where participants of a trial, including witnesses, jurors, counsel, are not allowed to speak publicly about what's going on, and this is a method to ensure fair trials. The SHIELD law protects reporters from revealing sources, and many states have actually passed laws to protect reporters from having to disclose sources. Defamation is not protected, and this includes libel and slander, which are very similar. Libel is the written word, slander is the spoken word. What makes libel and slander difficult to actually prosecute is both of these are spreading false information with the intent to harm someone. And anytime the burden of proof is to show intent, it's going to make it very, very difficult. And public figures must prove that there was malice behind the spreading of this information, which is why most often we see celebrities who have very bizarre stories written about them in the tabloid. It's tough for them to actually prosecute and win cases involving libel and slander because they can't prove that the reporters or the paparazzi were intending to create and cause harm and defamation. Obscenity is a tricky one, and I'm going to talk about a specific case here in a second, and it must violate community standards. And then student press. Student press actually is probably one of the most restricted forms of freedom of speech, and this is because student newspapers, student broadcasting programs are not public forum, so it can be restricted. Now, going back to obscenity, I need to refer to another Supreme Court case, another PowerPoint. And again, libel is printed falsehood that harms a person, slander, spoken falsehood that harms a person, and both of these have to be done with intent. Obscenity is not protected by the Bill of Rights. However, it is very difficult to determine if material is indecent versus obscene. So, for example, the Supreme Court case in 1978, the Pacifica Foundation versus the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, involved the now deceased, very funny comedian George Carlin. Ask your parents about him. I'm sure they will know him. Where his comedic monologue, I suppose, filthy words, was broadcast one afternoon over a radio station owned by the Pacifica Foundation. A dad was driving his son home from school, and this comedic clip was playing. And essentially what the filthy words shtick was is he developed this entire monologue around the 7 words you can never say on television. I can't tell you what those words are, but the first one starts with S, the second one is P, the next one is F, the next one is C, then we have a compound one that is CS, another compound that is MF, and then the last one that is T. I can't tell you these and record them on a PowerPoint because that would be super inappropriate, but if you want to ask specifically what they are, feel free to look them up or talk to me in class, and maybe we can figure out a way where I don't tell you them, but I help you figure it out. Anyways, this routine was very filthy, very inappropriate for a young kid to be listening to. So the dad actually sued the radio station for playing what he deemed to be obscene material on a public access network. And the Supreme Court actually upheld the FCC by a vote of 5-4, ruling that the routine was indecent but not obscene. And the court accepted as compelling the government's interest in shielding children from potentially offensive material and ensuring that unwanted speech does not enter one's homes. The court stated that the FCC had the authority to prohibit such broadcasts during hours where children were likely to be among the audience, and gave the FCC broad leeway to determine what constituted indecency in different contexts. So, to sum up, if you think about watching TV, let's say that the movie Old School or Wedding Crashers is showing on TBS or TNT. If you watch that same movie on TBS at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it's going to be much more limited. You're not going to hear cuss words. There's not going to be certain scenes. It's going to be, I guess, all audience member friendly. However, if you watch that same movie after hours, I guess, so past 10 p.m., you're going to see a less edited version. And the reason is the FCC has the authority to regulate what type of material in terms of sexual content, cuss words, violence, all that stuff can be shown during certain hours. And if the FCC catches a different media outlet showing indecent material outside or within those hours, then those radio stations, TV stations, cable companies are able to be fined. If you guys remember, at the Grammys, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, the Grammy people, whoever they are, the executives in charge of the show, the producers, actually sent a letter out to all the participants explaining that there was a certain dress code they had to adhere to, and that if celebrities were going to be on stage or during performances, they had to kind of keep it clean. And the point of this letter was the producers at CBS, who was showing the Grammys, did not want celebrities to do something that could come back and get CBS in trouble, because the FCC was going to be watching the Grammys to ensure that nothing too inappropriate, too indecent would be aired. And it's on the responsibility of the TV network or radio network to make sure that what the public sees is appropriate. Again, companies are able to show indecent information or material within the confines of the limits set by the FCC. However, under no circumstances can obscene material be seen. So I know that was a lot of information. We can talk about it more in class. If you have specific questions about either that Grammy situation or FCC versus Pacifica, we can talk about it. But essentially, another good example. Those of you who watched the Super Bowl where Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson performed, 5-6 years ago, another good example. Fox was airing the Super Bowl live. And if you guys remember, there was a part in the choreography where Justin Timberlake was supposed to, I don't know what the objective was, pretend to take off Janet Jackson's top. Anyways, he did it too well, so that part of her breast was actually exposed. And Fox was responsible for that being aired, and they actually had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in fine because they were negligent and let indecent material be viewed by a worldwide audience. And so freedom of speech is actually not as limited as people might think, but there are still certain limits that the government can set.